at the pipeline, as Piero mentioned, it's empty in phase 1. So what do we have now? We have 5 new drugs, 3 repurposed drugs in the pipeline. There are 2 classes there, the darapininoids and nitrolizoles, that are great interest. But we also have the oxylizones, and particularly 2 drugs there, citazanate and AstraZeneca compound that is of interest. Just to note on one of the drugs, citazanate, we've known that this drug has had TB activity for quite a long time, yet the rate of progression of the development of this drug has been extremely slow. And I think it just highlights really the lack of prioritization in this space for R&D. And then, of course, we have the repurposed drugs. But I would say that we have specific problems. We may have specific problems for some of these new classes of drugs as well. We don't really know whether they can ever really be used as first-line pan-TB regimens. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to understand what space that they will occupy in the future. And of course, when you look at a slide like this, at least for a clinician like me, I'll just say, uh-oh, because there's a big gap in the middle, and you really don't know what's going to happen with these drugs, which are new or repurposed drugs, and whether you can construct a regimen that's beyond just keeping the status quo. And so this is what's really important to understand. About 10, 15 years ago, we all had this ambition that we could develop very short course TB regimens that are less than 1 month long, that we could treat people as outpatients, that having TB treatment would be theoretically very easy to do. But yet we've moved completely in the opposite direction. We've started having longer and longer regimens because of multi-drug and extreme drug-resistant cases. And it is what I can certainly say is that with the drugs here, we are not going to achieve a pan-TB regimen that's less than 1 month long. None of those drugs are really going to be able to deliver something that is going to be very short, safe, effective, and easy to implement in a very wide-scale way. So we can really get ahead of the kind of TB epidemic, because it completely changing the whole game is what we are looking at. But we are very far away from that. All we're trying to do now is develop regimens that can treat multi-drug and extreme drug-resistant cases, maybe with 6 to 9 month regimens, which is the status quo with drug-sensitive TB. That's how long the drug-sensitive TB regimens are, for 6 months long. So that is very, 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 very far away from the ambition we've had some years ago.
So just if you could go back to like I said this morning, this is out of date.
Yeah.
It was updated last year, and things have changed. So perhaps if you want to use it for the purpose of this work, we should update that section.
Yeah. That's the last year's slide.
Yeah. So that means that I registered certificate that Jackie and Moxie for the purpose of the studies basically are incorporated as professionals who they going to be given as the
Yeah. So the phase 3 trials on this semiconductor has not yet started, right?
So that is it's registered based on the phase 2 study.
Yeah, still in phase 2 though. So what is needed from our perspective in the short term, at least operational research, to shorten drug-resistant TB regimens with the drugs that we have, and we believe we can get to a 9-month regimen. There's already trials ongoing to do this, but we need to invest in these trials and get them finished as quickly as possible. In the medium term, we need to develop short course regimens, which are all oral regimens, using as a backbone the new classes of drugs. And there are clinical trials that are being proposed to do this. But in the long term here, as I mentioned, we still have this dream of creating these very short pan-TB regimens that we can use across the world. And with improved diagnostics, we can basically start rolling these out and maybe look at different operational strategies of how we look after TB patients in a completely different way, which is not very focused on high investment vertical programs. So I think we need to we are very far away from that, and we need to look at a lot of resources if we want to move towards that game rather than just playing catch up all the time with resistant strains of TB. This is a slide showing TB research funding trends. It's a global figure for drug R&D, but it encompasses a lot of different strands of research. And I think it was the figure thinking maybe the figure for 2012, correct, it's up there. But what you do see in this kind of macro pie chart, which was actually a report compiled by Tang, is that there's few funders, big funders in the game. So basically, it's the US government, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, plus a couple of companies that are really putting the money for TB R&D. And if you think of this as a global public health problem, it's quite stunning to look at this chart and actually see that where the resources are coming from is in such a distorted way. Now, there are some gaps in some, I have to say, in the data that's been collected here, but I think it does demonstrate that, I think the total amount of money that needs to go for R&D needs to be significantly increased, but I think the funding needs to be diversified as well, and for me, there needs to be a lot more public responsibility in funding coming for TB R&D. So very quickly on where's an investment. I won't go through the slide, but I think it's just to basically say that even that pie chart may reduce somewhat because the big funders are more or less staying at status quo, and everything now depends on the remaining companies that are investing in this area, how much they will continue to invest in the future. And one thing that I would say is that in the previous years, those companies were going through very big clinical development programs, which now may be winding down, so we don't know whether that pie chart is going to get a lot smaller. So that's something that we need to look at. But we do have also a particular problem in the translational space of funding TB R&D that needs to be better supported. So I'll go through this very quickly because I'm aware I'm running out of time. We started to look at a little bit of an idea to look at how we can better incentivize the TB R&D space, looking at also utilizing an open collaborative model. And that's looking at two parts, how data can be shared, how technology and drug candidates can also be shared to produce what we want, which is what Piero said earlier. We're not looking for individual drugs, for instance. We're not looking for an individual diagnostic machine necessarily. What we are looking for are drug combinations and diagnostic platforms that can be integrated with other diseases, for instance, and other forms of resistance testing for other types of drugs. Because that's, from a public health point of view, that's what we need. We need to take a more kind of integrated, horizontal approach to the research and development. So we are trying to find how you can encourage creating that space so that we can develop tools we need for TB, but tools that can then be integrated into public health systems that can really drive strategies to kind of, I would say, implement control strategies in a much more feasible way, and actually just deliver more humane, rational treatments for patients. So the big question is, how do we achieve a space like this? And we thought of looking at how you can align your incentives through different ways. Most of this is common sense and has been done to a variety of different degrees in other disease areas. There's nothing new with what we are proposing here at all. Yeah, but just looking at it through 5 steps, not necessarily done in a sequential order. Obviously we need to incentivize early stage research, and I think a lot of ideas have already been put on the table by this group on things that could be done in the space. We could also fortify and accelerate preclinical development through a variety of push and pull mechanisms. So when we talk about push, we're largely talking about de-risk grant funding, but when we talk about push and pull mechanisms, certainly for the pull mechanisms, there are a variety of different things that could be done, which I'll come to in a minute. We also need to accelerate regimen-based clinical development after getting candidates through preclinical development. And we also need to maybe look at how we can secure resources for the kind of large clinical trials that need to be done. But the last step is also how can we bring together developers and manufacturers and suppliers so that you have multiple suppliers in different regions, but producing quality assured combinations of TB drugs that we require, and that can actually be then rolled out in a rational way, so we don't have irrational use of drugs. And just to give an example, there are some, I would say, even category 5 TB drugs where we are being seen being prescribed in kind of the health sectors and private health sector especially, with very little controls in place, and we are burning through the current TB drugs that we have not yet even registered for TB, but are used as second and third line drugs, which is very worrying. So when we need to think ahead in terms of how we incentivize research and development, but also how we can responsibly market, say, fixed dose combinations of ideal regimens that can be developed. So this is kind of a slide kind of trying to put it all together. I will briefly explain that what we want to try and do is to have a mixture of push grants that can come at various stages in the R&D cycle, from very early on to quite late on. But what we could also look at is prizes throughout, where you could perhaps look at setting up small prize funds in the early stage that can answer very specific scientific questions, to maybe a kind of special milestone prize for a developer who develops who obtains gets an IND license for a compound that can then go to clinical development, to maybe a much bigger milestone prize at the end of phase 2B, when a group or consortium of people have come up with a regimen for a new TB regimen that fits a specific profile. And this, what we hope to see, is also find a way to encourage to bring all these different people together. There's one additional part, which is the third P, which is about how we pool intellectual property. I think another way of phrasing it is really how you manage intellectual property in this process. And there we need to think about maybe some kind of mechanism of how you bring people together, foster some kind of stewardship in terms of the business development side, bring partners who can then be encouraged to work on putting the technologies together so that they can come up with a technology like a combination of drugs for a TB regimen. And there I think it's about how you can partly de-risk the whole process, but partly also think about how you can incentivize and therefore share the reward. Now, it is a very different model to a kind of winner-takes-all scenario, but I think in this kind of model, you can't really have a winner-takes-all scenario. I think it's very hard to envisage how that will work. And perhaps what you can have is an individual entity that can bring it up to this point. They get a specific prize or payout, and they maybe check out of the process because they don't have anything more to contribute in this level. And then here you have a different consortium of partners who will take over the responsibility for continuing the development of not just one drug, but maybe multiple drugs, up to a point where you can then license it to a company who can then manufacture it and market it in a specific region with specific, I think, rules in place. So I think that's kind of what we're trying to do, with kind of have de-risk money with push funding, having specific prizes through pool funding, and pooling, I think, of technologies and data and intellectual property as a kind of basic precepts. Now, when you throw these things, you can change these things. These are not set in stone. This is just an example. And there are very many different versions of prizes. I mean, prize can be a recognition or very small financial prize, or maybe a much bigger financial prize, to something completely different at the end. You know, some people also talk about, say, advanced marketing commitments as a form of a prize. So there are just different ways in how you can model these incentives. But what I'd like to emphasize, there's been a lot of work, policy work done in the last decade. These have all been well described. And what we're trying to do is trying to pull together the best elements into one framework for TB R&D. I'm not going to go through these slides because I've already mentioned the idea of what we want to do with pooling. But what I would say is that this is in a concept trying to implement what a lot of people call delinkage. And I think this is probably a very difficult word to explain to some people. And some people have even argued whether delinkage is the right word of describing it. But essentially, I would say the way that I think we would try to describe it is that you want to basically find a different incentive and reward system rather than just sales and marketing through the current way we're doing it. Why would you need to do it for TB? Well, because you don't necessarily have a market for TB, so to speak. So if your company will produce a drug, you know, how are you going to get your return for the drug? And I think we see this dilemma in a company like Johnson & Johnson, which has developed a drug like bedaquiline. You know, we can say, well, you price this drug and it's too expensive, which we think it is, but then we also recognize the irony of, well, they also deserve a reward for developing the drug, but there isn't the right framework to give them that reward, right? So that's, on the one hand, that's a problem, but on the other hand, you can't look at high sales volume for drugs that you want to conserve. That doesn't make sense either. So there are kind of two principal reasons why you want to implement a different kind of framework for drugs for diseases like TB. Prize funding, we've talked to a lot of people about this, and this is where we need a lot of help to understand what is the right size for prizes. And some people say 2 times the invested capital cannot only invest for early stage prizes. But then we don't know what the invested capital on average would be, right? And it all depends on the individual developer and the stage of research and all this. So that's kind of how long's a piece of string question. On the other hand, we don't want to stifle innovation, but we do need some kind of clear product profile so we can judge what is a successful winner. We need to have some rules of the game. We can't, otherwise there'll be, we don't want to kind of raise false expectations and then say, oh no, we don't like this, we're not going to reward you. So we do need to set some clear guidelines and say, what is it we're looking for? And perhaps these can be very macro or big picture thinking and not so prescriptive in the type of product profiles. I think in terms of then looking at the influence model for early clinical development, I think a lot of you have already talked about this, but do we want to also incentivize this? Is it just enough to say you want to crowdsource, for instance, on specific things? Do you also want to implement small micro prizes? Not even just to say you want to financially reward people, but it's just to say that you want to recognize what that person or individual group of collaborators have contributed. So there's a variety of different ways of how you can construct these core funding or these prizes, for instance, and it can range from very, very small token but highly symbolic prizes to very, very large financial arrangements of developers who've done the heavy lifting, particularly at the later stages when it's quite expensive. But I think one of the also kind of expectations we have is how do you also then figure out, the fact that you're going to put in a lot of public money into this, that's going to de-risk the R&D, and how do you then take into account the public investment that's been put in, and does that change the dynamics a little bit? I think I'll basically end here. I think what we kind of hope that this model will do, which is again can work in a very virtual way and really aims to utilize all the existing players in the TB field, because I think all of those players are currently out there. The aim is to keep them in the game and perhaps bring more players into the game. But at the same time, what we'd like to see is reduce the level of duplication that may be happening, people working in silos. I think continue to de-risk the process, focus on developing what we need, which are regimens and combinations, and ultimately also reduce irrational use and risk of resistance. And I just want to emphasize that we are really envisaging a very virtual structure to the project. And a lot of these different things, whether you have a scientific committee that can look at the target measurement profiles or set priorities to grant or prize-making bodies, to decide who wins, to open collaborative platforms, that we're talking about the IP pooling mechanisms, we believe these exist already in existing entities. So we don't necessarily see anything having to be created to house some of these different elements that you would have for a virtual project structure. But we've tried to put it together in a kind of diagram. But what we do see really essentially is that we want to see kind of existing entities that are here to kind of play a role in developing this model that can maybe, I think, change the dynamic. Now, what is the big question is where's the money going to come from, particularly for a lot of the things that we're talking about, like the prizes, for example. Now, we do know there are existing funders who are already there, and we want to keep those existing funders in the game, but we want to bring in new people who can fund this, and they can either come from the public sector or the private sector. I think I'm probably not the best person to say where we can leverage money from the private sector, so be interested to hear from people like you on that. But certainly from the public sector, I certainly think that we need to look at a lot of the work that's been done the last 10 years to raise this whole discussion about R&D and innovation and funding of innovation to leverage more funds from particularly governments. So there are solidarity mechanisms that we can go to. There are institutions like the EU that have already earmarked TV and say the IMI framework that we have already been talking to about this topic. There is also, I think, potentially new sources of funding that can come from emerging economies, particularly I think the BRICS countries that I think are have a huge TB burden, by the way. So there's a huge self-interest issue here for them to support this kind of framework. And I will end by saying that, in case some of you may or may not know, there was the BRICS countries have recently, Fortizella, they made an announcement to launch the BRICS Bank, which is a bank that's going to have at least $50 billion worth of investment already put in from the five BRICS countries. The bank is going to be based in Shanghai. I think they'll have an Indian president of the bank. But they are looking at funding sustainable development projects. And something like this very much falls, I believe, in that category. And we could and should be looking at leveraging funds from these kind of new sources of funding for ideas like this. Anyway, I will end there and maybe take any questions now. And sorry to race through it, but I'm just aware of the time. Sure. Yeah, I think there's a big others box in that chart, and there's a lot of countries that fall into the others box. And it's partly because it all looks very distorted, because it is true that really, when you talk about actual sheer numbers of dollars, it really is the Gates Foundation, US government, and two companies that have really put all the money on the table. And I think you can dress that up whatever way you want, but that's the reality, at least in the study that was done. Now, I think you can critique the study and say, well, maybe some of the data flows on funding R&D has not been completely uncovered. Sometimes it's not clearly made available in the public domain, etc., etc. But yeah.
India and China put together 25% of the
I think, it's between 8 or 10 million cases of TB globally. There's estimated to be around 600,000 cases of MDR. At least in the study that was done. I think if you dig down and say, well, maybe some of the data sometimes yeah, so the Global Fund, if you talk about, I mean, this is not a space for the Global Fund, right? I think the Global Fund can play a role in helping downstream of these drugs and medicines that are coming onto the market. UK potentially could have a role, they could help to fund certain parts, and we have had some discussions with you on this, but if they don't go too far upstream as well, which means you have to go look at either the traditional or non-traditional R&D funds. I think we need to look at use mistakes. And I think certainly if you are now interested in putting money and funding as part of the so TV is falling in very much. But I think if we could think about how we develop the incentives at least to go beyond just opportunity costs, then I think we can keep a few companies interested in staying which I think would be very important. B, you can bring in some smaller companies, and you see you might be able to attract a bit more investment into R&D. So that's why I think that I can arrange
that we don't develop any way of synthesizing the enantiomer even when it is economical and
still on, man.
So is there a trial now? No. And so the thing about so we also the
Share of the client is gone.
so it's taking a long time for those start to become ready to mention to link it to another mantra it's always been referred to, that is that in order to register the drug, you need a company to take the drug within their of course you do need a company to market to register the process could have been done and just so one that is good in producing
Voice?
Yeah, that's how you have to complexity that you have to put through the components together and develop them in time.
How come my speaker sound is only so much? Huh?
And then you also need to do additional formulation work to ideally develop FTC. I mean, this is very, very important.
Here no sound at all.
Because, you know, people
have video
3-day malaria treatments.
No,
but
video.
Imagine if you were to take 6 months worth of
For me, videos
and the amount of pills you have to swallow as a TB patient. I mean, we calculated 14,000 pills to swallow if you have MDR, not to mention all the injections you need to have. And we have, you know, we have patients who physically can't look at their pills anymore because they start retching. It's such a powerful response from people now because of the sheer volume of pills that people have to take. So you can't underestimate the value of the collaborative part, not just but also here, developmental part, where you really put together, look at specific issues like ones of interruptions that have to go on here, but then looking at the formulation work that needs to happen, and then looking at optimizing the regimens, the dosing, looking at the pharmacokinetics, the pharmacodynamics of the different measurement profiles, and then finally delivering the regimen that you can then also look at special populations, including, which is frequently forgotten, children, right? So a lot of this work can be mutualized, I think, by different partners who enter the game. And I think that's why you have to think about where you line up the incentives and how you share the incentives. But at this point, there's one thing may also, you know, the 3 or 4 entities involved in this who maybe say the consortium or developing these 3 or 4 drugs together may also decide that they will find maybe 3 or 4 companies that they will license out the products to that and can then take care of the sales and marketing with some very specific conditions in place. And that's, for instance, exactly what happens now with any drug that, you know, a company puts into, say, the medicines patent for HIV drugs. There are very clear stipulations on where the product can be sold, in which countries, under which conditions, and so on. And we have to put those things in place for TB drugs to prevent kind of irrational, I would say, use of these drugs in irrational marketing of these drugs. So that's very, very important. But I think that's the struggle, of course, is how do we then stitch together this framework so you're more likely to create this kind of, I would think, collaborative framework of partners, both from the scientific end to the much more developmental business side of it at the end.
Part of that, if it becomes complicated like that, with 20 different components, I think it's the defining industry, this idea of the great, because you say you have to manage it, but so maybe sometimes you don't have to manage it. Because if it's an open process, then people who might want to do work development will come to the project themselves.
Yeah, as long as you have a framework where you line up certain things, then yeah, you don't have to manage it, because nobody can manage it. I mean, we've tried to do that in the past. We've got PDP dedicated to working with on TB, for instance. We have big funders, but nobody. We've attempted to set up CPTR. That's done a lot of good work. So I mean, we have set things up that can play a role in these different aspects. I don't think we need an overarching institute to manage this at all. That's not at all what we're looking for. It's the opposite. Yeah.
And if you're open, you can see that. Clarify that. Well, where is it at the school? We need this bit.
You need the next slide.
Cool.
The mechanism.
Yeah.
But isn't it exactly the role that the situation before that you just can take the components in a way in a virtual approach? What we're suggesting is you want to price it rather than describe that model also people that what he wants to apply generally in Pharma, this would be nothing else. This would be
yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. So there's two.
Yeah.
As you said, the first 20 kg GMP material, that's not the issue. The issue is how to get the things that you're taking where it gets expensive. I don't know.
But that's why you can't rely on one mechanism. You can't rely purely on push funding, which is what we're doing now, because that has significant limitations. And we still have a problem of overcoming how we create a much more collaborative framework both at the early stage and at the late stage, right? And on the other hand, I mean, when we talk to companies about this, they're very honest to say it's just not, there's no appeal to stay in this area at all. I mean, they have to have a very strong case internally to justify why they have a TB research program, or they have an individual champion who keeps it going. The minute that person leaves, well, that can just all fall to nothing tomorrow. So that's what I mean. You can't just rely on putting one price there and everything gets sorted. I think you need to look at where you're going to put in different elements into the whole cycle. But I would also add that what we also need is an absolute increase in the total amount of money going into TB R&D. This is not about just restructuring the current money that we have. I think you need a significant injection of resources into an area like TB R&D, because if you look at what we're spending, how big the global problem is, and the distribution of the cases, and the problem of drug-resistant TB, and how far away we are from developing an anti-TB regimen. But we are very, very far away from that. The needs and the gaps are huge. Therefore, correspondingly, you need to put in a big investment. So I don't think we have to get over that point first before you move on to the next discussion.
So to that extent, right, like it is about you have to show some return, but some idea to at least net it out. When you talk about rethinking, so your slide on rethinking price and revenue as an option, other ways that you get rewarded. Do you have any ideas around what that might look like?
Yes, and actually that's already been described, in that discussion's already been quite extensively described in a kind of few policy meetings that have happened around antimicrobial resistance. So the idea of, I don't think delinkage is the ideal word for it, but let's just use that because we don't have a better word for it. Because it's a very kind of technical policy word. But for instance, GSK have already proposed the concept of delinking the kind of, I would say, the incentives and reward for developing an antibiotic from sales and marketing. And we started with that precept from the very beginning with AMR because you're talking about antimicrobial resistance and you want to prevent irrational use of antibiotics. So you have to start moving away from the idea that you want to sell loads and loads of the stuff, right? And you also have to move away from this very simplistic idea of originators versus generics, because it's not at all useful in this space. You have to look at a very different model of how you're driving the whole development of these products, and then how you're consequently marketing these products. And therefore, things like where you line the incentives up, how much you put into the model, and how you manage things like intellectual property are quite interesting. I mean, I think they really allow us to enter a very different space to where we've traditionally been when we've talked about when we've had this discussion on areas like, say, HIV. So that has been described. And so, of course, then the big question is, if you then look at things like providing, payments as you go across based on performance or output, and also we don't talk about making arrangements like then, having, say, advanced marketing commitments, or having very large payout prizes at the end, which could be staggered. So this is what GSK had suggested, essentially making yearly staggered payments once an antibiotic is registered and is marketed over a period of time. And those payments can be adjusted depending on the product itself, how good or bad the product is. So there's some flexibility on that level, because often you don't find out the real social value of the product till fairly close to the end, right? And sometimes even after phase 3, you may understand a lot more information on how you can use the product. So that prize itself can also be staggered over a period of time. At the same time, you make very clear commitments on the volumes of the product required, and that can also be handled by another partner. That can be out-licensed to someone else who has maybe capacity to make that at a more kind of cost-effective manner. So there's ways of how you can manage this. But the big question is, you still need to put money on the table to de-risk the R&D. Even when you talk about prizes, you're still therefore arranging. You still have to put money to basically reward the people for being in the space. So it's not about saying that this could be cheaper because the way of organizing the process has maybe improved and better, but it's still going to cost a lot of money. And therefore, how you share the responsibility of where that money comes from is, I think, also a big question, as well as how much would it be adequate to reward the development. How much would J&J, for instance, be interested in having in terms of a return for being involved in this, right? And you could say how much I'm really interested after this one, and taking it all the way, and so on. And that's the kind of information we would be interested to have, as a bare minimum to stay involved in this space in a meaningful way. And that's the kind of feedback we also need from companies as well, in terms of the realistic number. Yeah, so I think this is like a prize. I think that's a really good idea. I mean, some of these smaller prizes could, you could open them up to crowdfunding. Actually, theoretically, all the prizes could be opened up to crowdfunding. What you need is just you need to recognize that there's a large sum of money that will have to go for the prizes. But the other thing that you can also remember, and I think you can use to leverage, particularly to some of the emerging economies, is that the prizes are something you pay when you get an output, right? So in some ways, it's a far more attractive way for an emerging economy to put money into the R&D in the area like TB. So I think that's certainly, the approach that we should be taking for specific countries in terms of the resources.
What about leveraging some of the disease foundations for refugees, for example, which that by lots of people for disease. You guys have millionaires in China, and that TB is relevant down there. I think that from research, identify people who might be looking to be part.
Yeah, and so that idea of creating a prize, I mean, that's the whole idea of even the longitudinal prize. It does two things. I mean, first of all, it creates possibly an alternative mechanism, although it has to be big to really create a credible mechanism, right? But secondly, it creates a profile, which I think in itself can be used to generate more funds for the prize itself, or more sources of revenue for the prize itself. And that's why, trying to get a few high-profile governments and R&D funders and even individuals involved, as well as looking at things like crowdfunding, is really an excellent way. I think you have to look at all those different sources and diversify your funding revenue. I mean, you look at the concept of Unitaid, which looks at levies on airline tickets. For me, that's a much more sustainable way of funding R&D in the longer term, right? Than sorry. through airline tickets. So there's a small, very small kind of tax put on airline tickets in specific countries in the world, and all that money goes into Unite. But you could easily look at a variety. I know taxes is a dirty word for that some people, but there are just different ways you can create funding in a more sustainable manner. And certainly crowdsourcing could be one of them. And the more diversified the portfolio of funding for some of these ideas, the more sustainable it's ultimately going to be.
When I have a challenge with basic hypothesis, you were expecting, we're saying various countries are interested in this problem, and they will not fund it. And the governments or here are interested in getting this. My experience on the ground, none of these governments are seriously interested in getting any of these jobs. It is not that the governments do not have money. I mean, we don't have their response. We are seeing plenty of money that we have not created enough public